Pryor, you listen to me. I don't care what you do once this thing's over with. You can lay down and die and rot in the street.
The Dan Blocker Story, A Life Beyond Hos Cartwright. Dan Blocker became famous as Hos Cartwright on the TV show Bonanza, but his real life was much more interesting than most people knew. Recently, his son has shared some secrets about his father that fans never knew before. This is the story of a man who was much more than just a gentle giant on television. Dan Blocker was born on December 10, 1928, in a small town in Texas. Right from the start, he was different from other babies. He weighed 14 pounds when he was born, which was huge for a newborn. His real name was Bobby Dan Davis Blocker, and he grew up in the tiny town of O'Donnell, Texas. His family owned a grocery store, and young Dan helped out by carrying bags for customers and doing other jobs around the store. Even as a child, Dan was much bigger and stronger than other kids his age. By the time he was 10 years old, he was already working alongside grown men, hauling grain and doing construction work. People in town started calling him the Big One because of his impressive size. When Dan turned 12, he was already 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds. Some local troublemakers tried to pick fights with him, but Dan never lost a single one. After finishing high school, Dan went to Texas Military Institute, where he played football. He was so good at the sport that he earned a football scholarship to Sul Ross State University. By this time, he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 275 pounds. He was an imposing figure that was hard to ignore wherever he went. Dan's path to acting began by accident. The college drama club needed someone strong to move heavy stage props, so they asked Dan to help out. What started as a simple favor turned into something much bigger when he got a small role in a play called Arsenic and Old Lace. Dan discovered that he loved being on stage and felt excited about acting. This experience made him change his college major from English to theater. Even though professional football teams wanted him to play for them, Dan decided to follow his heart and pursue acting instead. His dreams eventually took him to New York City, where he hoped to make it on Broadway. His hard work and talent paid off when he landed a role in a production of King Lear, which was a major step toward his Hollywood career. But before Dan could fully focus on acting, he had to serve his country. After college, he joined the U.S. Army, which was quite a challenge because of his enormous size. It took the Army a whole month just to find boots that would fit his massive feet. Once they got him properly equipped, Dan was sent to fight in the Korean War. By Christmas of 1951, Dan was stationed on the front lines near Chorwon, North Korea, as part of the 179th Infantry Regiment. As a combat infantry sergeant, his strength and determination made him a powerful soldier. For nearly 7 months, he and his fellow soldiers faced brutal battles in freezing cold weather, with little sleep and constant danger from enemy gunfire. The fighting was intense, with explosions echoing through the air as Dan led his men through some of the war's most difficult battles. One night, during heavy gunfire, Dan saw one of his fellow soldiers pinned down and unable to move to safety. Without thinking about his own safety, Dan charged forward through the dangerous gunfire to rescue his comrade. This brave action got him wounded, but it also earned him a Purple Heart Medal for his courage. The battles on Porkchop Hill were some of the hardest fighting of the entire Korean War. It was a place where just staying alive felt like winning. Dan and his unit fought on the front lines, defending every piece of ground in an area where every hill and valley came with a terrible cost in human lives. After months of continuous fighting, Dan was finally taken to a hospital to recover from his battle wounds. When Dan came home from the war, he carried with him the harsh memories of what he had experienced. Even though he had fought with honor and bravery, the war changed him deeply. He became strongly opposed to war, especially military actions that relied on violence to solve problems. Having seen firsthand how destructive war could be, Dan became a passionate supporter of peace. He spoke out against the horrors of war and was particularly upset about the use of napalm, which caused terrible suffering. After returning from Korea, Dan was ready to focus on building a peaceful life with his family. He married his college girlfriend, Dolphin Parker, and together they had 4 children. They created a warm and loving home that helped Dan heal from the trauma of war. While acting wasn't originally part of his plan, life had a surprise waiting for the tall Texan. Dan decided to pursue a doctorate degree, so he moved to California and enrolled at UCLA. It didn't take long for Hollywood casting agents to notice his massive frame and charming Southern personality. At that time, Western TV shows were very popular, and Dan seemed perfect for that type of role. His impressive size and rugged good looks made him ideal for the tough cowboy characters that Westerns required. Dan started getting small parts in popular Western TV shows. He appeared in series like Gunsmoke and Colt 45, bringing warmth and humor to every character he played. Throughout the 1950s, he steadily built up his acting experience by appearing in well-known shows such as The Rifleman, Have Gun Will Travel, and Maverick. While he occasionally appeared in movies, television was where he really found his calling. In 1957, Dan got his first major break when he landed a significant role in The Restless Gun. His performance impressed audiences and opened doors to even more opportunities. Soon after, he took on a recurring role as Tiny Boinger, a lovable and funny ranch hand in Cimarron City. This character allowed him to show off his natural ability to make people laugh and gave audiences a hint of the charisma that would soon make him famous across America. Dan's big break finally came when he was cast as Hos Cartwright on Bonanza. This role would completely change his life and make him a household name throughout the country. As Hoss, the warm-hearted and towering son of the Cartwright family, Dan became a regular presence in living rooms from coast to coast. Hoss was portrayed as a gentle giant who might not have been the smartest member of the Cartwright family, but he more than made up for it with his big heart and genuine kindness. Audiences, especially children, quickly fell in love with Hoss's straightforward charm and his unwavering loyalty to the people he cared about. For Dan, Hoss was more than just a character to play. He was a way to express his own beliefs and values on screen. Dan was inspired by the words of Stephen Grellet, an 18th-century Quaker missionary who encouraged people to do all the good you can. Dan brought this philosophy to life through his portrayal of Hoss. It was this underlying sense of justice and compassion, which came naturally to Dan himself, that made Hoss's kindness feel real and earned him a special place in viewers' hearts. While Hoss was portrayed as simple and innocent, Dan himself was actually an intelligent and thoughtful man. He had earned a master's degree in theater and had a deep appreciation for literature and philosophy. His portrayal of Hoss balanced tenderness with a fierce protective instinct, a quality that reflected his own life experiences as a decorated Korean War veteran who understood both the cost of conflict and the value of peace. Dan's imposing physical presence certainly made him perfect for the role of Hoss, but it was his gentle nature that truly brought the character to life. Just 2 years into his acting career, Dan became part of one of television's most beloved families. Behind the scenes, he formed close friendships with his co-stars Lorne Greene and Michael Landon. The three men shared a bond that went far beyond their professional relationship. Dan even served as best man at Michael Landon's wedding, which showed just how deep their friendship was. While Bonanza kept him very busy, Dan occasionally appeared in movies, acting alongside Frank Sinatra in films like Come Blow Your Horn and Lady in Cement. Despite his growing fame, he never forgot his roots in the small town of O'Donnell, Texas. The people back home were incredibly proud of the quiet, thoughtful boy who had grown up to become a television star, bringing joy to millions of viewers. Even though Dan's portrayal of Hos Cartwright made him famous, he was never really comfortable with all the attention that came with being a celebrity. He loved acting and was passionate about his craft, but the constant spotlight that followed him everywhere was something he found difficult to handle. He would have preferred to focus on his work quietly, but his natural talent and the love of his fans made it impossible for him to stay anonymous. Dan appreciated his fans, but he found the loss of privacy overwhelming. His towering height made him easy to recognize wherever he went, and even simple family outings could turn into chaos as fans eagerly crowded around him. On one occasion, what was supposed to be a quiet family vacation to the Yucatan quickly became a public spectacle when locals immediately recognized him and began calling out Hos Cartwright wherever he went. Unlike many actors who craved the spotlight, Dan had little desire to remain in the public eye. In 1970, he and his family took a trip to Switzerland, inspired by the beautiful scenery of the Swiss lake country that he had read about in National Geographic magazine. They were captivated by the peaceful landscapes around Lakes Como, Maggiore, and Lugano. For Dan, the scenic beauty and the chance to lead a quieter life felt like a dream come true. The family decided to make Switzerland their new home. There they found not only the tranquility Dan had been seeking, but also high-quality international education for their children, who thrived in their new surroundings. Some people started rumors about why Dan had moved abroad, with some speculating that he was having financial problems. But Dan dismissed these claims, explaining that Bonanza had made him quite wealthy. His decision to move had nothing to do with money. Rather, he simply yearned for a life away from the pressures of fame. In Switzerland, Bonanza was shown on television in German, which created a language barrier that allowed Dan to enjoy his surroundings without being constantly recognized by fans. The Swiss countryside offered him the peace he had been longing for. Despite his success, he remained humble and down-to-earth, always aware of the privileges his career had given him. He often expressed concern for people who struggled financially, especially underpaid teachers, whom he admired greatly. Dan had a thoughtful perspective on his own career, and even acknowledged feeling somewhat conflicted about his wealth. He once remarked, "Let's face it, I sold out for money." Though he occasionally thought about returning to teaching, his fame as Hos Cartwright made it difficult for him to step back into a quieter, simpler life. During the 1960s, the cast and crew of Bonanza often traveled to different locations for filming. One trip took them to the southern United States, a region that was still deeply struggling with racial segregation. Even though the civil rights movement was pushing for change, prejudice remained strong, and many hotels, restaurants, and theaters still refused to serve African Americans. During one of these trips, the Bonanza team arrived at a hotel only to be told that their African American crew members would not be allowed to stay there because of the establishment's discriminatory policies. The entire crew was shocked and outraged by this blatant act of injustice. Dirk Blocker, known for his kind spirit, stepped forward with firm resolve. Without hesitation, he announced that if the hotel refused to accommodate everyone on their team, then no one from the cast and crew would stay there. Dan's words weren't just an empty threat, they were a promise. In that moment, he showed that his sense of fairness wasn't limited to the roles he played on screen. It was part of who he was as a person. Dan's commitment to justice was as strong as his physical presence. Beneath his gentle demeanor was a deep-rooted hatred for any form of bullying or oppression. In a 1964 interview, he explained his feelings simply. "I hate a bully worse than anything. I'm a big man. I don't like fights, but if I see a 180-pound guy beating on a 130-pound guy, you can bet I'll take care of the big guy in a hurry." Dan understood that his size and strength gave him power, but he saw it as a responsibility, a gift meant to protect others, not to intimidate them. His courageous stand against racial discrimination during his time on Bonanza reveals a lot about his character. By refusing to accept injustice, he demonstrated how one person's actions can challenge unfair systems and make a real difference. Since Dan wasn't just known for his towering frame and kind heart, he was also famous for his enormous appetite, which was as large as his personality. People who knew him couldn't help but be amazed at the sheer amount of food he could eat. He would start each morning with what most people would consider a feast: a dozen eggs, 2 loaves of bread, and 2 quarts of milk just to begin the day. As the day went on, he would pile his plate high with meat, potatoes, and more bread, finishing servings that left others stunned. Dan's appetite was truly legendary. True to his Texas roots, he loved hearty, down-home meals. One of his favorite treats was a whole roasted ham, which he could easily eat all by himself. He wasn't particularly interested in fruits and vegetables, but he had a well-known sweet tooth, especially when it came to cakes, pies, and cookies. His love for good, filling food, even extended into his business ventures. Dan became a co-owner of the Ponderosa Steakhouse chain, named after the famous Cartwright family ranch on Bonanza. The restaurant served exactly the kind of generous, satisfying food that Dan himself loved, and as a co-owner, he had the benefit of being able to eat for free at any Ponderosa location. But even as Dan enjoyed these perks, he knew that maintaining Hoss's beloved image required some discipline. The demands of Hollywood meant he had to balance his love for food with the realities of show business. He went through cycles of strict diets and intense exercise, trying to stay in shape for his role. Yet the temptation of his favorite dishes often proved too hard to resist. Between his emotional connection to food and the abundance of meals available on the TV set, His weight would frequently go up and down. By the later seasons of Bonanza, these constant weight changes took a toll on his body, and Dan struggled with the yo-yo dieting. Eventually, he needed padding to maintain the familiar, larger-than-life appearance of Hoss on screen. Still, Dan's legendary appetite never decreased, and the cast and crew would watch in amazement as he tackled meal after meal with enthusiasm. When the cameras weren't rolling, Dan's love for food continued to astonish those around him as he could out-eat anyone in the room without breaking a sweat. In the early 1970s, as the Vietnam War created political tension in the United States, Dan made a life-changing decision. He and his family moved to the quiet, scenic countryside of Switzerland, seeking a peaceful retreat from all the unrest. Even while living abroad, Dan's commitment to Bonanza remained strong. He frequently traveled back to the U.S., dedicated to bringing the Western classic to life for audiences who adored him. As the show neared its final seasons, however, Dan's health began to decline. He was diagnosed with gallstones, a condition that, while common, still required surgery. Dan underwent what should have been a routine procedure to remove his gallbladder. At first, it appeared the surgery was successful. He seemed to be recovering well, and his loved ones felt relieved. But in a cruel twist of fate, Dan suffered a sudden complication, a pulmonary embolism. This unexpected blood clot proved fatal, and the loss of Dan Blocker sent shockwaves of grief through his family, friends, and fans worldwide. News of his passing on May 13, 1972, shook the entertainment world. Co-stars and fans mourned a man known not just for his commanding physical presence and charming personality, but for his warmth and kindness. Tributes poured in, honoring his contribution to television and remembering the heart and humor he brought to his iconic role as Hoss. In the midst of the grief, however, a strange story began to emerge, a tale that would capture imaginations for decades. And some people claimed that Dan Blocker was buried in a piano box because he was too large for a regular casket. The story seemed almost as larger than life as Dan himself. At over 300 pounds, he was known for his impressive size, and it wasn't long before rumors began to spread that a piano box had been the only container large enough for his burial. The story took on a life of its own, blending fact and fiction into a myth that, for some people, seemed almost fitting for a star of Dan's stature. But the truth is far less dramatic. Dan Blocker was actually laid to rest in a standard casket at Woodlawn Cemetery in Santa Monica, California. The story of the piano box is simply a colorful legend born of Dan's unique presence and the love people had for him, but it has no basis in fact. Though the tale might be amusing and even oddly comforting to some fans, it is just that, a legend. The sudden loss of Dan Blocker, especially since he was so central to an ongoing series, left an empty space that could never be filled. When Dan passed away, the shock affected far more than just his family and friends. It touched fans and colleagues throughout the entertainment industry. To those who worked alongside him on Bonanza, his absence was deeply felt. As Hos Cartwright, Dan had been the heart of the Cartwright family, embodying the warmth and humor that connected with audiences. His larger-than-life presence and kind spirit had made an unforgettable mark on the show, and his passing left a hole that no one else could fill. With the start of the final season approaching, the cast and crew faced the difficult task of moving forward without him. Dan's character Hoss was central to the show, and his loss presented a major challenge for everyone involved. Many ideas were considered for how to address his absence, including dedicating an episode to his memory or gently writing Hoss out of the storyline. But in the end, the producers made the bold decision to acknowledge Dan's passing directly within the story. This approach gave both the cast and the audience a chance to grieve, paying tribute to Dan's life and allowing them to say goodbye to Hos Cartwright. The task of writing the first episode after Dan's death fell to Michael Landon, who played Little Joe. Landon chose a subtle but powerful approach, letting Hoss's absence be felt in the silence and unspoken emotion shared by the Cartwright family. The original plot had focused on Hoss's romantic journey, but after Dan's passing, Landon rewrote it to capture the grief of losing a family member without explicitly explaining Hoss's death. He believed that silence could speak volumes, conveying the depth of loss in a way that words never could. On the set, the weight of Dan's absence was clearly felt. Filming that first episode without him was both painful and healing for the cast and crew, who shared stories and memories of the man who had brought so much joy and warmth to their lives. In the familiar setting of the Cartwright family dining room, where laughter and friendship had once been normal, a new bittersweet mood settled in. Every corner of the set seemed to hold traces of Dan, and though the crew carried on, his absence was felt in every scene. Without Hoss, Bonanza was never quite the same. The show's popularity had already been slowly declining, and Dan's passing sped up its fall. NBC moved the series from its prime Sunday night time slot to Tuesday night, putting it in competition with ABC's popular movie broadcasts, which drew viewers with hit films like Brian's Song and Ben-Hur. Ratings fell, and despite the cast's best efforts to keep the legacy alive, the magic of the early seasons was hard to recapture. In the final season, Bonanza struggled to regain its momentum. Without Hoss's heart and humor, the show felt different, and viewers began to drift away. After 14 seasons, NBC finally decided to cancel the series in 1973, bringing the Cartwright family story to an end. Even during the show's most successful years, Dan had sensed that this day would eventually come. In interviews, he spoke honestly about the inevitable end, acknowledging that the show's success couldn't last forever. With remarkable foresight, he predicted that the sheer number of episodes and rising production costs would one day make the series too expensive for the network to continue. In the end, Dan Blocker's passing marked a turning point, forever dividing Bonanza into two eras, the years with Hoss and the years without him. While Bonanza has since become a timeless classic that is still enjoyed by fans decades later, the impact of Dan's absence was undeniable. He had been the heart and soul of the show, and without him, Bonanza lost much of the warmth that had made it special. Growing up with the iconic figure of Hos Cartwright as his father, Dirk Blocker was deeply shaped by Dan Blocker's larger-than-life presence, and ultimately, by his untimely death at just 43 years old. This profound loss didn't just affect Dirk's personal life. It left a lasting impact on the career path he would choose to follow. Despite stepping into the world of acting like his father, Dirk carried with him a desire for a quieter life, one far from the spotlight that had constantly surrounded Dan. The younger Blocker reflected on how witnessing his father's fame had actually steered him away from pursuing stardom. He had grown up seeing Dan unable to go anywhere without fans gathering around him, eager for a moment of connection. For Dirk, the appeal of being a character actor, a role that allowed him to act without the relentless spotlight, was far more attractive than seeking fame. The tragic turn came on May 13, 1972. Dan Blocker, known not only for his talent but for his warmth and humor, passed away following what should have been routine gallbladder surgery. Complications led to a pulmonary embolism, and he died at Daniel Freeman Hospital in Inglewood. The suddenness of the event shook Dirk to his core. He had to deal with a loss so deep that it pushed him to seek comfort by losing himself in his work and daily life. While he appeared composed on the outside, he held on to the grief of losing his father, who had been his greatest source of guidance and support. Over the years, Dirk's understanding of his father deepened. He came to appreciate the rich, multifaceted life Dan Blocker had led. He was not only a celebrated actor, but also a man with a passion for justice, a commitment to political causes, and a generosity that touched many lives. Dirk found inspiration in the way his father embraced life, kept his sense of humor intact during challenging times, and remained true to his values no matter what challenges he faced. Dan Blocker's story is one of a man who was much more than the gentle giant character he played on television. He was a war hero who fought bravely in Korea, a civil rights advocate who stood up against injustice, and a family man who valued peace and kindness above all else. Though he found fame and fortune through Bonanza, he never forgot his small-town roots or the values that shaped him. His legacy lives on not just through his memorable portrayal of Hos Cartwright, but through the example he set as a person who used his strength and influence to help others and stand up for what was right.